Today is our last lesson on demand and supply. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to recap demand and supply charts and then go through the last part of this, which is equilibrium. So what we have here, again quickly, just to go through it, this is the demand schedule. And if they give you this, you'd be expected to draw the demand curve. Price starts at 50, goes up to 200, quantity demanded starts at 200, goes on to 80. You have to draw this here, and if you see here, the lower the price is, the higher the demand is. So when you watch it in the graph here, you can see that the lower the price, the further over demand goes. So when our quantity demanded is very high, our price will be at its lowest point. When our price is at its highest point, our demand is going to be low. So we see here that the graph will always point in this direction. So I'm actually going to see if this works here. So you'll always find that the demand will move, or the curve, or the demand curve, we call it can be a curve. In this case it's a more linear line. It'll always move in this direction. So it'll always go this way. Okay. And again, when the price is low, demand is high. When the price is high, demand is low. And we have this taken down into our copy. I'm going to copy this line and use it on other slides. So this is our demand curve we see here. If I go over to the next slide, we see that if the demand curve increases, the line just moves further right. So the further right the line goes, the higher the demand. So if I have, again, I'm just going to go back to this here, and I've lost my little line. If I have a demand line that's here, that's at a fairly low, it's a fairly low point in the graph. The maximum price is 100 and the demand maybe might be 10, and the lowest price here might be 10 and the demand is 40. So that's quite a low point. So this would be my lowest point, this would be a median point, and maybe something like this here would be the largest point. As you can see here, the demand might be 250 if the price is 10, let's say, and if the price was 260 here, if the demand would be 120. So you can see here that the further right over it goes, the higher the demand curve. So we looked at that there. The increase in demand is the further right it goes. Now let's look at supply. So supply here, we can see our curve, our schedule first, and when price is at its lowest, quantity demand is at its lowest. When price is at its highest, quantity demand is at its highest. So we can see this here is very different. The demand curve was going in this direction. It was always going in this direction. Whereas if we look at this here for supply, it's always going in the opposite. It's always going from zero out. If price is at zero, the supply will probably be zero. And as the price goes up, the amount that's supplied goes up as well. I'm just going to throw that out here. So you can see here the price is at its lowest, quantity demand is at its lowest. Price is at its highest, quantity demand is at its highest. So this is my supply curve. And again, the line will always go here. Now, if we just jump back to this slide here, we can see that if supply goes up, it also moves right. Supply goes down, it moves left. So the further right over in the graph you go, the higher the supply line. So if I have a supply line here, price is, we'll call it here, when the price is 100, the quantity demand is 20. When the price is, 240, the quantity demand is 100. That is a lower supply curve compared to here, because now my price is maybe still around the 100 mark, but my quantity demand is much, much higher. So the further right you go, the higher the supply and the demand. The further right you go, the higher the demand or supply. So that's supply. Now let's look at our last part. So our last part is finding a balance between, because we've done all this, these slides up to that point. So this is finding a balance between demand and supply. So in the marketplace, supply and demand interact until a balance of equilibrium position is reached. So if you notice that a supply curve always moves in this direction, a demand curve will move in that direction. At some point, they'll have to meet, and that's our equilibrium. So supply and demand interact until a balance of equilibrium is reached, and that's what it looks like here. So finding a balance between demand and supply, and this is more like what a market looks like. Market equilibrium is the point at which, it's the price point at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. So we can see here that when the price is low, suppliers don't really want to supply much of the item. As the price goes higher, they're more willing to supply. But the consumer, the buyer, takes the exact opposite standpoint. When the price is really high, you don't want to buy it. As the price drops lower, you're more interested in buying. So let's pretend that the prices here are not 50 euro. Let's pretend it's thousands. Let's pretend this is 50,000, 100,000, 150,000, 200,000. If you could sell your house in the morning, well, selling your parents' house or gardens, if that was to go up in the market in the morning, and you could get 50,000 for that house, you probably wouldn't be willing to sell it. Let's say you own multiple homes. You might be only willing, you own 200 homes, let's just say that. You might only be willing to supply a small amount of homes if the price is only going to be 50,000. But if the price goes up to 200,000 per home, now you're willing to supply maybe 150 of them. You're willing to supply much more. So that's you, the supplier. But what about your friend? Let's say the supplier's name is Mary and the buyer's name is John. So John is the buyer. John doesn't want to pay 200,000 for a house. So when the house is worth 200,000, John's only willing to buy 80 of them. As the price drops down to 50,000, John will buy all 200 houses. So as the price gets lower, the buyer is going to be more willing to buy. So we see this here, and this is an intersection. When you draw your demand curve, which you'll get from, this is your supply curve from the supply schedule, and this is your demand curve up here from the demand schedule. And when you're given both tables and you draw it out, you'll find that there'll be an intersection point here at some point between your demand and supply curves, and that point we call market equilibrium. So market equilibrium is the price point at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. So I'm going to get you to, when you're taking this down, again, if you want, you can pause this and take a slide down, or you can take it down after. This point is going to be called your market equilibrium. So I'm just going to include a text box here. That's my market, if I can spell it right, equilibrium. So that's my market equilibrium here, is that point at which they meet. It's my market equilibrium point. And it's the point basically at which demand and supply meet. So the supplier who's offering their house will continue to obviously offer more houses as the price rises, and they get to about the 150 mark. So when the price is at 150, the supplier is willing to sell 120 houses. And when the buyer is looking at the houses, they want to pay as little as possible. But they'll find that there'll be very little supply until they reach the 150 point, and now there's more supply. So this is at the point at which the buyer is willing to buy 120 and the seller is willing to sell 120. That's my market equilibrium point. Just to make it a little bit easier, to go through an example, we have one here with physical numbers, and we'll work it out. So the demand and supply curve for pure confectioneries companies protein bars are shown in the diagram below. Show the equilibrium price and quantity of the protein bars to write your answer in the space provided. So what we see here is that we have our line here, D, and we have our line S. There's no prizes for guessing which one is which. This one is moving downwards, here is our demand line, and this one moving up here is our supply line. Very important that if you were to draw this out, if you're given the information to draw this out, that you label the lines. Now they meet at this point. What do we call this point again? We're going to call this our market equilibrium point. So that's our equilibrium point. So I'm going to just again insert a text box, and right here. So that's my equilibrium point here at which they intersect. It's that intersection point is called my market equilibrium point. So what we're asked to get here is we're asked to find the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So how do I do that? Well, where's my equilibrium point? It's the intersection line here, that intersection point. So that's my intersection point. But if I want to find the equilibrium price, where can I find price? If you remember when we drew the graph, this here on my y-axis is the price, P. Again, very important that you label your graph when you draw it. That's my price. So if I'm trying to find the equilibrium price, I have my equilibrium point, and I have my line here showing all my equilibrium or all my price details. So if I go from this equilibrium point and I go across, I'm just going to do this. I go across from this here all the way over to the line, I can see that the equilibrium point is at price of €3. So my equilibrium point is at a price of €3. So when I'm filling this out and I need to show the equilibrium price, I can see that from the point over here to the graph, it's €3. I thought again I had included a text box. Let's just throw another one in. So it's going to be €3 is my equilibrium price. And for my quantity, again, that's my equilibrium point. If I work my way down to the x-axis, I can see it's at approximately 20 if I had that straight. So it's at 20. So if I work down from the equilibrium point all the way to the x-axis, I can see my quantity is 20. So my equilibrium quantity to move this down here, my equilibrium quantity is going to be 20, and that's how we fill it out. So we're asked to find our equilibrium price. You get your point, you go across to the y-axis to our price line, it's €3. We're asked to find the equilibrium quantity. We work our way down to the x-axis here because this is our quantity, and it is 20. So my equilibrium point is at a price of €3. There is 20 quantity demanded. So that's the end of our chapter on supply and demand. This is an example of me working out the equilibrium price, and I'm going to be giving you a little bit of homework now just to get yourselves used to working it as well. Thanks for listening.